Hello, class. Welcome to Chapter 13. This chapter is on migration. But of course, we're not just going to be talking about migration, we're going to be talking about immigration. And this is really important because, as you've been learning in our previous chapter on environment and sustainability, our environment and economic system is not terribly sustainable right now. And we are going to end up with lots and lots more migration and immigration in the future as our world heats up and people are forced to move from some areas of the world to others. So these are going to be important topics. Let me move on to these chapter goals. So the chapter learning outcomes for this chapter, chapter 13, one more time, make sure you're in the right place, are why do people move from place to place? Who are today's migrants? Where do people move to and from? And how is immigration affecting the United States today? There are a lot of misconceptions about migration in the United States, and unfortunately, it's because, well, one of the many reasons is because it's become so politicized over time, and people have their own separate camps. So what I'm going to be trying to do is present an alternative view, one that is less grounded in politics, and one that is a little bit more grounded in facts and the ways that anthropologists try to study this subject. Of course, you're going to take other classes that are going to have a different perspective on migration than anthropology, and that's totally fine. I'm not saying that this is the be-all, end-all perspective, but it is the perspective that anthropology brings to this subject. So, why do people move from place to place? I've got some images here of people moving from place to place, but migration has been on the rise in the last few decades. Not just the last few years, but the last few decades. More and more people are migrating ever than before. Some of that has to do with global capitalist flows, now capital and jobs and moves around the world faster than it has ever had. So people have to move to follow those jobs, to follow the deindustrialization of the Midwest, for example, to move to other countries where that labor is being pushed, but also we have better technologies. It's easier. You could jump on to move and migrate around the world than it ever has been. You can jump on an airplane and move to another country, this afternoon if you felt like it. We also have better access to information because of the internet. It's a lot less scary, such as when I moved to South Korea. I'm going to be using that example quite a bit. When I moved to South Korea about 15 years ago now. We still had the internet back then. It was newer in 15 years ago, but we had the internet, and I didn't have to wonder what Korea was like. I didn't have to wonder what I should bring. I just got online and started talking to other Americans who were currently living in South Korea, and I asked them, what should I bring? What can I expect from the immigration authorities? What are the do's and don'ts? Like, there's just so much more access to information that makes immigration much, much easier. And this will probably continue as globalization continues, as these processes I've been discussing continue and get more intense. So again, this is made possible by improvements in transportation, communication technology, which allow immigrants to stay in touch with the people they left behind, and also to save money. And we're going to be talking about that quite a bit, to send money, excuse me. We're going to be talking about that quite a bit in this lecture too. While migration is often inspired by economic concerns, it is not an easy process. I have migrated before, several times in fact, and it's never easy. It's easier than it has ever been, but this is not a simple decision. This is not an easy decision. It's emotionally, intellectually, physically, kind of gut wrenching in a lot of ways. And I had all sorts of access to resources that many migrants today of today's migrants do not have, and it was still very, very hard. So I'm going to be trying to bring that in my migrant experience. So while migration is often it is not easy. I'm sorry, I already read that. What drives people to pull up their roots and move sometimes half the way around the world? It is not an easy decision. Oops, there we go. Nope, go back. So why do people move from place to place? I'm going to introduce this concept of pushes and pulls. Every specific place that you might migrate from and every specific place that you might migrate to has a unique set of pushes and pulls. So what draws Americans like me to a place like South Korea is totally different than what draws an American like me to China, to Europe, to South America, to Africa, to any other place, or from any other place. There's an infinite amount of pushes and pulls that are specific to the push and to the pull, to the place that people are leaving from and the place that people are going to. So pushes motivate migration from a place. Things like poverty, famine, natural disaster, climate change, war, ethnic conflict, genocide, disease, or oppression push people out of a place. So right now, lots and lots of Ukrainians are being pushed from Ukraine in the sense of migration, that there's a war going on there. There's famine, there is ethnic conflict, there is oppression. So that is a push. But for me, when I moved to South Korea in 2008, one of the biggest pushes for me was economic, and that was that there were no jobs in the United States in 2008. I had just graduated with my 4-year degree in anthropology, and nobody was hiring any brand new graduates. You needed to have years of experience to get into the field. At that time, there just weren't very many jobs at all. That was a real economic crisis that was supposed to be once in a lifetime, but as COVID-19 hit, I came to realize it's not a once in a lifetime collapse, but that was a push. The U.S. economy was not doing well. They were not hiring people with my degree, but South Korea was. That was a pull. Polls attract migration to a place. Now, that's not the only poll, as I will discuss. So, things that attract people to a given place are jobs, higher wages, education, healthcare, access to investment opportunities, all sorts of different kinds of polls that are specific to that place and sometimes to certain kinds of people. So, in my case, South Korea was pulling anybody who had a degree from an English-speaking country. That is a country where English is the primary language. So that was me. I was a native English speaker, and I had a degree. It didn't matter what it was in, and so that pulled me toward South Korea. Now, other people like I know a lot of Filipino people speak beautiful English. They speak excellent English, but they were not being pulled to South Korea because South Korea has a frankly kind of a racist law that says that it has to be a first language. Many Filipino people speak English as a secondary language fluently, but they're not allowed to go to South Korea and teach English, even though their English is sometimes better than some of the other people that were teaching English there. They're not allowed to go, and you might make the argument, and people have made the argument that they are not being pulled there because they're not white, they are not European, and so their English is looked down on, even though their English is just as good. So polls attract migrants to a certain place. Oftentimes it is a specific kind of migrant. So the polls attracting me as an American to South Korea are totally different than the polls that might attract a Filipino person to South Korea, who might be drawn instead into agriculture or construction labor or something like that. So next I want to talk about bridges and barriers. I'll put my face down here, why not? So bridges and barriers. Why do people move from place to place? Bridges are factors that encourage migration. That's family networks, transportation links, government immigration policies, recruitment agencies, and even human smugglers. The existence of a bridge, that is, you could have a bunch of family in another country and you're thinking about going to another country for work. That other country, let's just say it's India. You have a bunch of family in India. Well, if you're looking for a job in another country, India would probably be high on your list. And the same reason that in the United States, on the West Coast, there are lots and lots of Chinese people today, second, third, fourth, fifth generation Chinese Americans. Well, that's because there was an original population of Chinese immigrants who were attracted to California during the gold rush. And because there were lots of Chinese people there, that created a bridge for other Chinese people over the last 100 years to come. It made it easier for them to come. That's a family network, right? The existence of direct transportation links, either by ship or airplane or something, government immigration policies, which have not always been favorable to certain people, change. And if they are favorable to certain groups of people from certain countries, then that creates another bridge and will encourage more and more migration. So I didn't really have a bridge to South Korea. I had never taught ESL before. I didn't know anybody in South Korea, but there were huge communities of Americans living in South Korea for a very long time, the last 50 years. There's our military bases there. There are lots of English academies, and so it was easy for me to hop online and find these Facebook groups and other kinds of online message boards where I could find other people, make friends with them, and move across. Government immigration policies between the United States and South Korea are very favorable. I could just go to South Korea without even a visa. I couldn't get a job, but I could just enter the country and start looking for work on a tourist visa that was 90 days, totally free. Very easy to immigrate as an American to South Korea for work. So there are also barriers, though. There are barriers or factors that discourage migration: language difference, geographic distance, tightly regulated borders, and expenditures for passports, visas, transportation. I'm sorry, my screen's in the way. I have to keep moving. And immigrants encounter both of these wherever they go, no matter what. So even though I had lots of bridges for me to get to South Korea, there were also barriers. The language barrier was incredibly difficult for me when I moved to South Korea to teach English. And even though I ended up living there for about 4 years, taking lots of language classes, I am far from fluent in the language. It's a very difficult language to learn. And I'm not bragging about how much I know. I don't know much. I wish I was better. The geographic distance was a barrier. It might have been better to go to a closer country like Canada or Mexico. That would have been much easier for me, but there were enough bridges and enough pulls that I decided to go to South Korea anyway. Now, I know this video is getting a little bit long, but I want to point out something that I find interesting. All of these bridges and barriers, well, maybe not all of them, but the majority of bridges and barriers, and also, let me get my screen to work, also, pushes and pulls are man-made. They are economic factors that we decide. They are things like war and conflict that human beings have chosen. There are things like government immigration policies, networks, transportation linkages. All of these things, not all of them, but many of them, the majority of them, I would argue, are actually man-made. So anytime you see a lot of immigration from one place to another, or don't see a lot of immigration between two places, it is often the result of several things, such as, geographic distance. That is something that's not necessarily man-made. Language barriers are tough, but they can be eased with human input, human choices. Many of the reasons why immigration happens is because of choices that human beings have made. Now, doesn't mean that all of them are intended consequences, but for example, the global flow of migrants from the Mexican border into the United States, that is the result of pushes and pulls, bridges and barriers that the United States and other countries have set up specifically between ourselves that have a long history, and the amount of migration that we get from some countries in South America, wanted or not, is the logical result of those human choices that we have made. So I'm going to end it there and just kind of ruminate on that a little bit, that we have the ability, a lot of control over pushes and pulls, bridges and barriers. And we'll talk more about that in the next video.